Okay, I just wanted to make sure my microphone is connected. So one second, it's not
Okay.
showing up. So, okay, can you hear
Okay.
me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Does that
Yeah.
sound clear?
It sounds better than um a minute ago.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. I
Yes.
just want to make sure everything's working. Great. How are
Yes.
you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well also. Good.
I love that space. This looks like a reader and writer's just like heaven back there. All the books. Are you at home?
I am at home.
Yeah.
Yeah, I split my time between Connecticut and New York City. And so I'm usually here in Connecticut from like Thursdays through Mondays, and then back in the city Tuesdays, Wednesday, Thursday. So this is my office in Connecticut.
Nice. It's so nice. I'm in like a co-working space kind of thing, but there's
Oh,
these little like pod rooms that really work well for recording things. So you can hear me okay, yes?
yeah, I can hear you great. Where
Okay.
is your co-working space?
It's in Dumbo in Brooklyn.
Oh, nice.
It's Soho House.
Hmm.
So it's like Soho House also has Soho Works. They have like the co-working spaces. So it's the one in Dumbo. I live like half a block from here, so it's very convenient. Um, yeah, but
That's
thank you so much.
perfect.
Yes, yeah, it's good because when I first started recording these, I just did it out of my apartment and learned on the job that Wi-Fi is not great and like you need pretty good Wi-Fi to be able to record a podcast and everything. So this has worked out. But thank you so much for your time and for agreeing to chat with me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I guess I should officially welcome you to Voices on the Side. And I know you have your own podcast and but you're also you guest on other podcasts a lot too. I feel like I've seen a few.
Yeah, I did a whole big push for the book launch.
Of course.
And so I was on, I don't know, maybe 25 podcasts. It was a lot. But before then I hadn't really, I'd been on a handful, but it wasn't a top priority. But it was really funny. I mean, at one point I was recording like 4 a day on top of all the normal, like my normal work as a
Right.
person. And was starting to get really burnt out from it. So I took a little bit of a break and I feel much better now. I think
I
it's a little
mean,
too much to talk about oneself that much.
right. And do you just start to forget, like, if you already said this thing in this conversation or in that conversation? Like, is it hard to keep track of when you said what?
Yeah, I actually kept a spreadsheet.
Yes. Yeah. That was good. Um, but I would love to just start with just the beginning. I was thinking though about your podcast. You talk a lot about like various topics and you give a lot of good advice, but I wondered if you've talked much about yourself from like your identity, this obviously Voices on the Side is about uplifting Asian stories or just any it has started as Asian stories, but I think as these interviews go on, I'm reaching a little bit further, like it's been focused on Asian women. But I really believe in the importance of uplifting all marginalized quote marginalized stories. I hate saying that word too because it's more just like from a cultural perspective that our Asian identity has been marginalized, right? Like, but I'd love to just how do you identify yourself?
Yeah, I haven't explicitly, um, I don't actually don't know if how explicitly I've talked about my Asian identity, but it's a really important part of who I am. And I think, the trajectory of my life has been about changing who I am, wrestling with a lot of different parts of my childhood and young adulthood, and then figuring out who I really am outside of, the way that I thought I was. So that's actually like the crux of my work is very much like, my company is called Reset because it's this idea that we are always changing and we have agency. And a big part of that has been the way I think about my identity. And I grew up the daughter of a Vietnamese immigrant. So my mom came to the States in 1975 when she was in her teenage years. So I think she was maybe 16, 17. And then she had me and my brother about 10 years later. And I grew up in a very um, Vietnamese neighborhood. It was like, it's Northern Virginia where a lot of people came after the war. And I think there were something like 65,000 Vietnamese people living in this area at that time. And so we had these amazing shopping centers that were all Asian. One of my Vietnamese friends who's from Boston went there recently and she was like, "Oh my God, Liz, it's amazing. You can get the best food. It's so incredible." And at the time I hated that. I didn't want, I hated that my mom had such a strong accent and that our house was, um, you know, very different from my friends' houses who I went to. Um, my mom didn't really like believe in, like Western medicine. And so whenever I'd get sick, she would take me to the acupuncturist. And I was like, "Ugh, why am I eating flowers and like weird brews in this crock pot that smells so weird?"
And the
Um,
smell like permeates the entire house, right? Like the smell. I grew up with Chinese herbs, and it just fills the whole house for like days, it feels like.
yeah. And like it's on your clothes and your hair. And when I went to college, my mom came with a feng shui master who started hanging up little mirrors and, crystals all over my house. Like this is a house that I shared with four white girls. I was like, this is so embarrassing. But it's funny because now as an adult, I am so grateful for the way that I was brought up where, I owe a lot of my fertility journey and being pregnant now to Eastern medicine, and traditional Chinese medicine. And I am a big believer in feng shui and, like, I think that that's really helped me as well. And even just, making a decision in my early 30s. I'm 38 now. So a few years back, when I was dating and, I thought what I really want to prioritize right now is I want to have a long-term fulfilling relationship with someone who, really understands this part of me. And I didn't actually really know what that meant, but I was sort of like, I just want to not date some white people for a while. I want to just sort of put and before um, I'd been in serious relationships with Asian people, white people, Black people. It's like, it wasn't anything that like I specifically, had really thought much about before, but then I wanted to be really intentional and think, okay, when I have a family one day, I want this to be a really important piece of knowledge about where they come from. And my Vietnamese heritage is really important to that. And, it really informs how I come into the world. And within like a few months of saying that, I met the person who's now my husband, and he is Asian as well. He's South Asian. So very different culturally. And his family is also like fifth generation Canadian.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so it's kind of different where, I grew up with family members who didn't speak a lot of English, and, English was my second language. Spoke Vietnamese first, learned English when I went to school, went to church that was all in Vietnamese, and he had a different experience, but it's been really beautiful to watch him, connect with his Punjabi heritage. And it's something that um, we're really intentional about for our future daughter, and for the life that we're creating, even just the two of us as a family. And it was really beautiful because we got together in 2018, and in 2020, when all this consciousness started flaring up around identity and particularly around the way that, Black and brown people have been treated. I really felt like my partner could understand viscerally um, some of the thoughts and questions that I was experiencing in a reclamation of identity from a racial perspective. And it was in a way that I think I had to do a lot of like teaching or struggling with previous partners who didn't have that same background. And so it's been a really, really amazing joy to do that. And then now, I'm pregnant and even just thinking about like what I name this kid, like my name is Elizabeth and I have a Vietnamese middle name. It's Tuk Nguyen. And it's a type of bird that exists in like magical mythical folklore in Vietnam.
Oh,
And I was so embarrassed of this middle name. It's spelled THUC hyphen QUYEN. And even Vietnamese people who hear my name, they're like, wow, that is dramatic. It's like naming your child, like it's the equivalent of naming your child something that's like, you know, like Pleiades, like something that's like
yeah.
very, very dramatic and like little soap opera-y. But that's what my mom really wanted. And I just remember being a kid and thinking, I just wish my middle name was Jennifer. So I just told people that because it was just so confusing. And now I'm, giving my daughter a name that has its origins in Vietnamese and Indian language. And,
Mm.
I was like really intentional about, um, you know, if people have trouble pronouncing her name, that's okay. They're going to have to live with it. And I want to teach her that she doesn't have to contort and make things easier for the people around her just because it's unfamiliar to them. And it's been really cool to see also my brother-in-law, he just named his kid this really long, like 5-syllable Indian name. And his name is Aaron, right? Like, and his parents wanted to give him a really easy name. And to see him when people say, oh, what's the baby's name? He doesn't apologize. He doesn't say, oh, like break it down for them. He doesn't give the baby a more simple nickname. He just says, this is the name. And people are always really confused and really struggle. And he repeats it. And then that's it. He's like, I'm not going to apologize for my heritage. And so I think that that's really where my identity is I think I went from a place of like deep embarrassment to a place of great pride for who I am and where I come from. And then even the desire to deepen that even more. I would love to get better at Vietnamese. I would love to live in Vietnam for 1 or 2 years, a little bit later on with my kids. I would love to find, childcare help from someone who's Vietnamese. I want to learn more about my family tree. And see, these are all things that I think add a richness and an interesting dimension to who I am. And, I always, when I was younger, wished that I could be white. And now I'm like, you know what? This is great. Like, I love being Vietnamese.
Yeah, I know. I love that. And I relate to that. There's so many parallels. Actually, my parents immigrated in 1975 and had my brother had me first 5 years later, and then my brother 4 years after that. I didn't know about the big Vietnamese population in Virginia, though. That's I grew up in California, so opposite sides. But yeah, there's this shared, I feel like, especially when we're children of immigrants, there's this shared experience of, I wish I were white. I wish my name was Jennifer. I used to write, I also wanted like a more androgynous name. And so in my books, like you write your names in your books. As a kid, I would write Bobby and my last name Kim. I just wrote Bobby Kim in all my books. Like
I love that.
I don't know why. Like I just it felt really white. Like Bobby felt white. And like, of course, Leah is not an Asian name, but I similarly spoke Korean first, even though I was born here because my parents were most comfortable, obviously, with Korean. That's what they taught me at home. And I didn't learn English until I went to school. So same as you said. And I started school with my Korean name, which is a lot simpler. My Korean name is just Sujin, which is phonetically readable, like it's just Soojin. But it looks weird to like an American eye, you know? So it's like, even though it's very, I feel like Vietnamese names, for maybe it's just because I don't speak Vietnamese, but I feel like there's such intricacies in the pronunciation that can be quite tricky. But Sujin is pretty basic, and Kim is pretty is pretty straightforward. But my name was always butchered, and you know, I was just like, same as you. I'm like, I didn't want people to know that that was my name at all. I think it's so beautiful that you are bringing that back into like front and center with what you're going to name your daughter. And by the way, when I read your book this summer, you were not pregnant at the time of writing the book. You shared a little bit about wanting to get pregnant, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And then I think when I first reached out to you, I didn't know yet. And I only saw when you posted on Instagram that you were pregnant. And I was so happy to hear that because it was like beautiful kind of follow up from how you left the book, how you left things in the book. But so you said that for your fertility journey had to do with Eastern medicine. It helped you. Do you mind sharing a bit about that? I mean, I feel like
Yeah.
a lot of my friends go through IVF, and um, I mean, yeah, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So we started trying to get pregnant when I was, I want to say 35. And my husband and I met a little bit later. So we started dating when I was 33 and he was 34. And so we were kind of like, okay, let's get this show on the road. Um, which, you know, is not a long time to be together. And so actually now in hindsight, I'm really grateful for the years that we had together, just the two of us. But at the time, I, you know, really wanted it to happen. And I'm a very structured control freak where I want to know the exact amount of time that something's going to take. I'm very timeline based. It's been a big journey of mine to release that and let that go. And we tried for a year and we went to see a fertility doctor at the end of the year. And she said, you know, everything looks fine. They did a bunch of tests and on him and me, and they couldn't understand why. And so she said, okay, why don't we try doing some IUIs, which is the more gentle form of IVF, where basically it's kind of just like medicated insemination, where they give you some medicine to really make sure that you're ovulating. And then right when you're about to ovulate, they take your partner's sperm or the donor's sperm, they pull out all the best sperm and then they inject it into you. So
Mm,
it's kind of like not as intense as IVF, but we went through and they were like, oh, based on your egg count and, you know, your hormonal indicators, this should definitely work. We don't know why I won it. And we went through a year of that where we did 4 or 5 IUIs and they were all medicated. So I was on a lot of hormonal medication, gained a lot of weight. Then when that didn't work, we moved into IVF and we did an egg retrieval and then we transferred over the course of the year, we transferred 3 embryos and none of them worked. And again, this was a new doctor. The doctor was totally baffled why it wasn't working.
mm,
You know, he had said initially, I feel so confident that you're going to have 2 kids from this. And when we got to almost the end of our embryos, he was like, huh, okay, this is
mm.
not what I thought it was going to be. So then we switched doctors again and I took a little bit of a break so I could finish writing my book. And during that time, I really committed to acupuncture. So I found someone who was really great and I had been doing acupuncture on and off, but then I got really serious and really followed the diet that she gave me as well, which, you know, her whole thesis was that I was really low blood and I had a really cold womb. And so
Mm.
I needed to do a lot of warming, which is something that you would never hear from a Western doctor. And so it was things like avoiding cold foods and eating a lot of broths, eating certain types of vegetables, taking herbs um, uh, from Chinese medicine and like making sure that I was building up that blood, taking different tinctures. And I really committed to it. And I was really serious about, you know, I wouldn't drink cold water. I wouldn't eat ice. You know, I made sure to eat lots of broths and I only ate warming things. Wore socks all the time. I constantly had my foot in a foot warmer when I was working, just to keep everything really warm. And then it worked. And we found out in the spring that that it worked, and I'm having a baby in a couple of months. And I really think that even learning about some of the concepts, like in Chinese medicine, then they call the uterus the palace, your children's palace, and just even starting to treat my body in that way, and think about, you know, how miraculous it was that there are all these channels that run up and down my body that are, you know, responsible for generating new life. And those channels have to be clear, right? And in Chinese medicine, also, the heart is directly connected to the uterus. And so, you know, when the heart expands and grows, it can, you know, nurture the uterus as well. And so, doing some healing sessions also to kind of open that channel was really beautiful. And I think that, you know, writing my book was really helpful too, because it allowed me to, you know, emotionally process a lot of things. And I think, you know, that combination of emotional processing, TCM, acupuncture, and then obviously IVF, it all worked. And, you know, I'd be really curious to see what happens when we try to have a kid again, because, you know, I actually feel like maybe we could have done it without IVF, but we never had a chance to try because you're just on medicine the whole time. But I felt so good in my body, and I still, you know, make it a point to take herbs and see my acupuncturist as often as possible, and to, you know, understand that my body is something that isn't just, you know, meant to be fixed. I think Western medicine, the conception is very much like you have a problem, you show up, and then you take care of it. You get some treatment to take care of the problem. And then the idea underlying TCM is so much more about making sure that everything is in harmony all the time, even before you get to the issue of a problem. And, you know, understanding that your job is to kind of keep everything in balance. So it was a great experience for me, and I'm excited to try to get pregnant again with this knowledge in the future.
Well, it also is right in line with everything you talk about in your book and what I imagine, like principles on which you see your clients too, which is this marriage of Eastern wisdom within like a Western, like if you're coaching, if you do executive coaching, it's in like Western constructs, right? You're helping people with their work and professional lives and everything else. But like you really insert this, like ancient ideas, the energy, all the like spiritual practices you encourage. Like it's basically what happened for you to be pregnant. It's like both things, right?
Yeah.
Which is so beautiful. And it makes sense now, knowing a little bit more about how you were raised. Like your mom just, this was just part of your life, like from the get-go, right? Just involving all of that. Like it was just, it wasn't something that you needed to get convinced on. Like it was already, you grew up in it. Maybe you had to get convinced on it like I did, as far as like not wanting to feel different from the rest of like our white communities and classrooms and things like that. But because you were just surrounded by it, I think there's this like amazing integration that you have. And I think there's something about when you are raised in the West and being able to communicate in this Western way for people who don't have the same heritage or upbringing to understand it. I think that's what your book really does, you know, like is you're talking about these sort of esoteric things, but in a way that's applicable for, you know, people that it's brand new to them. They didn't grow up in any kind of Eastern influence. So that's so cool. How did your, what like your Western doctors take it? Were they very open to you also seeing Eastern doctors and, you know, getting those treatments? And were there any issues with taking the herbs and tinctures?
I don't know if this is what I was supposed to do, but I just didn't tell them.
Oh.
and I just and I just really prioritized what my acupuncturist said to do. Because even now, as I prepare to have a home birth, and I have to go see the doctor sometimes to get ultrasounds and scans and, gestational diabetes testing, all the normal things that you need. And I just keep it really separate because I try to keep my mind space really positive. And I know what works for me. And I think that comes down to trusting my intuition. And I know that my doctor is coming to it from a very specific viewpoint, which is pretty wild that, my doctor is an expert in IVF, which is what I really trust him in. But in his whole medical career where he's done, almost a decade of training, he's only had to take one nutrition class in his entire career. That's how doctors are set up. And so I just think you're just limited in your perspective and you just don't know because that's the training field that you come from. So I'm going to go do my thing over here. And it's been the same thing with, as I think about, working with a midwife and, a lot of the more intuitive spiritual elements of giving birth, where I don't share that with my doctor because he's so limited. Like he even says, I just don't want to know. Like I actually cannot know that you're having a home birth. So just don't tell me anything. And so I kept it really separate, and my acupuncturist had worked a lot with women who've done IVF. And so she would say, stop taking these herbs at this certain point. So I really, really trusted her as an expert. And I think that's actually, an important part of this is really reclaiming and deciding for yourself what sources of truth are right. And I think, getting in touch with my identity has been a huge part of that because, everything I learned about Vietnam had come from my family who was very actually embedded in the colonial's perspective because Vietnam had been a French colony for so long. And before that, it was a Japanese colony. And before that, it was a Chinese colony. And so there was this mindset, especially with people in my mom's generation, that the French way was better. Even though my mom was doing a lot of these Eastern practices, she was Catholic, etc.
Oh,
And
us
then
too. My mom was too. Yeah.
yeah, which is not something that
It's
is
weird.
now. It's weird.
Yeah.
It's funny. We'd go to church every Sunday, and now I am a Buddhist, and it was something that I discovered in my late 20s, early 30s,
Same.
where I in earnest. Yeah, and it's been really beautiful to now be able to say, okay, this is a source of truth that I really believe in, and I know to be true. Same thing with Eastern medicine, and just saying, okay, this is something I'm going to hold for myself, and knowing that I have to rely on my doctor for a few things, and I respect him for the things that he knows about, but I also know that he has limitations.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing when people specialize, when medical professionals specialize in something, they are really good at that, what they specialize in, but then the zooming out is not really there, like taking into account nutrition or whatever, all the other things that make up our overall health. And I think it'll be really interesting to see, like when you have your daughter and I have two kids. I have a 9-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl.
Amazing.
And yeah, and then that's like a whole other layer when you become responsible for the health and well-being of your child. And there's so much that you don't know yet because you can't possibly know until you have the human being in front of you. But being able to have this trust in your inner voice right now and to know going into it, like what your values are and how you're going to take support from various people, and to know that there's no one person that can give you all the right answers, that it always has to go through your own filter, is really amazing. And I think more and more of us are trying to parent in this way. I certainly think it's true for people who are, not white American, because I think well, for me, like I spent the first half of my life fighting against what felt true to me because it didn't fit into what I was seeing, in like the mainstream. And then, like you mentioned, there's this like reclaiming that has happened, I think, for so many of us in the last 5-ish years. So many of us, at least Asian Americans. And part of it is informed by the trend, for me, by like the trends. Like it's become so trendy to have like to go see an acupuncture. I mean, for a long time, much longer than 5 years, but have an acupuncturist and to see a traditional Chinese medicine doctor. That's kind of made me feel like it's given me permission to own it more in a way, because it's become trendy. But then there's also this thing of like, wait, but I have like a deeper connection that goes beyond like the current trend of the moment. And for sure, having my kids, I'm definitely more interested in understanding what that is, preserving it, and being able to teach it to them so that it's not something that they need to, like halfway through their life reclaim, but to really be able to fully proudly be in that from the beginning. And like you're saying, like your brother-in-law, even just starting with this name, like the name he gave, is it an Indian name? Did you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just being so unapologetic about it. And it's so huge. And there is something too, I know what you're saying about having a partner that you don't have to explain to him what it feels like to not like to move through this world as not like of the majority, right? Like even though that's interesting, I'm curious though about his, like, he's fifth generation Canadian, you said.
Mm-hmm.
So my like that immediately makes me think it's got to be so different from having been, you know, child of immigrants, right? Like, do you see like a massive difference in the fact that like,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because he has such a different experience. Like his parents are kind of like the parents that I sort of wish I had when I was growing up, because it was always so embarrassing for me that like when my mom would pick me up from school and I was embarrassed of her accent and how she didn't understand things and the way she dressed and the way our home looked. And so he never had that sort of cultural struggle. His parents, they look Indian but their names are Sheila and Dave. And, his mom has said things in the past like, well, we're not really Indian, that kind of thing. And so he didn't really, struggle in the same way because his parents like put him in sailing and golf and skiing, and he knows how to do all these things to assimilate. But what's really amazing is that despite all of that, he still has been consistently othered all throughout his life. And so there's like real threads there that are true. And I never want to sort of tell him that his experience is less than mine or something like that. And though I have made that mistake in the past where I've been like, well, I clearly have it so much harder than you did. Right. But, like his experience is real, like his family, had people write them hate mail and say that you shouldn't live in this neighborhood. And, he's felt that same pressure that I think everyone does who feels an otherness. And I actually wonder too, if all of us, no matter what our backgrounds are, we feel sometimes like we don't fit in or belong in so many different ways. That's a core human wound, is this feeling of not belonging. And even for the people who seem to most belong, that exists somewhere for them as well. And I wonder if we're all, we all feel a little bit like misfits, or, we don't belong, or, no one will understand us. And I think that, I also want to own that and say, every person is unique. My children will be unique. And so what I actually need to do, instead of trying to get them to fit in any way possible, which is, I think, what his family had always done, was like, let's try to fit in here, is that I want to give the skills to be completely unapologetic about standing out and to have a lot of pride in who you are. And I think I've really tried to adopt that, with my identity, with my race, but also with so many other things. Like, I speak very openly and very proudly about growing up in, Section 8 housing and being, financially unstable. It's not anything I would wish on my children or my family, but it's an important part of who I am. And I speak really openly about it. And I think it makes people uncomfortable. And, I used to hide the fact when I was younger that I'd never met my dad before. And I would lie and say, oh, well, my dad is a lawyer and he is working in California right now, or whatever. I just make things up. And, you know, even when I was in high school, I went to go live with my uncle and aunt. Uh, and I would just tell everyone that they're my parents because I didn't know how to explain to these new friends that I was making that these were not my biological parents. And these are things that I speak so proudly and openly about now because they've made me who I am. And I think sometimes that's off-putting or uncomfortable for people when they're just trying to have a really casual conversation and they're like, so what does your dad do? You know, I'm like, oh, I've never met him. Who knows? You know, and it causes a pause where the other person is not really sure how to respond. But I think the important thing is to know that that discomfort isn't a bad thing. It's not bad for me to feel uncomfortable. It's not bad for that person to feel uncomfortable. And, you know, frankly, you know, during the pandemic, I had someone who wrote me about my podcast, which at that point I was doing with two friends who are both white women. And we were talking about creativity and, you know, the ability to tap into that during the pandemic. And someone uh, who is not white, who's Black, wrote me and said, you know, your podcast is this episode was extremely insensitive. And
Mm.
I couldn't even listen to it. And I really sat with that because I had always thought of myself as I'm embodying the minority perspective. I also grew up really poor. And so I really understand what it means to be marginalized. And then I had to realize that that story wasn't true anymore, that I was actually moving through the world with a tremendous amount of privilege that my fellow people who are Black and brown don't have in a lot of ways. And also operating with a lot of financial privilege that I've garnered as an adult. And I had to sit in this place of feeling really uncomfortable. I stopped doing the podcast for I think 4 months while I thought about what I really wanted to be about, what I really wanted to stand for. And I also wrote back to this person. I was like, you're right. I'm very sorry. And I think you know, ultimately the new format of the podcast stemmed from that uncomfortable email conversation with someone who was like, you're a horrible person. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like this was not sensitive. This was not good, but look how it opened the door to like a greater understanding of who I am and how I can put a message into the world that is much more needed than what I was saying before. And so I do think that that difference between the older generations, which is like, let's just try to fit in and be comfortable, and then now, and that's what they needed to do because they didn't have the privilege to stand up. And then now knowing that I do have more privilege and power and to say, yeah, like it's my responsibility now to make people a little uncomfortable.
Mm. Yeah, that's amazing. Are you still in touch with that woman who wrote to you? Did she write back, and like, how did that communication end?
No, she never wrote back,
Oh, she
which
didn't.
I think is fair. You know, like I think
Sure.
also it's like a lot of you know, one of the big messages from that time period was like everyone feels like, oh, well, my Black friends are going to like educate me about things. And I can imagine that it's probably exhausting to also feel like you have to be the one to guide people all the time. I mean, I don't want to put myself in her shoes or no, but I just wrote back and then she didn't write back, which I think is fair.
Yeah. But how amazing that you turned it into something that you paused and you're like, wait, yeah, how can I do better in what I'm putting out there? I think that it's a growth mindset. Is that what the official term is? Like when we have a growth mindset. So I think yeah, that's so important. Um, do you have thoughts on, I know that I think that you opened your you opened a physical space in 2020 or 29. It was like just
Yeah,
before.
2019.
Yeah, 2019, and then everything shut down. And um I know you talk about that in your book about like how stressful it was, how stressful it was that you were just on the precipice of this, and then the something that you couldn't possibly have imagined happen. um did you reopen the space?
No, I never reopened the space.
Okay.
So I, at that moment in time when the space shut down in March of 2020, it seemed like the worst thing that had ever happened to me because I had invested literally my entire life savings into opening and renovating this space. But in hindsight, I feel like it was such a blessing, um, because I didn't really enjoy doing the work of having a physical space. And I thought I did, and I think it was because I was coming from working in a really cerebral capacity for many years where I wasn't doing anything physical or tangible, or, I was basically just advising people, which feels so low stakes and so unimportant, that I want something that I could really feel with my hands. And I never reopened it because at the time, partially it was just, I just didn't have the money to. I was, it was too expensive. It was rent in New York. And also everything was just shut down for so long and different behaviors changed. People aren't going in person for classes. People aren't doing team retreats in person. Those were all the revenue streams. And so I pivoted and I went to a fully virtual business where I got much more deeply into executive coaching, which is the bread and butter of my work now. I also started writing during this time, and that's taken up a big part of my life. And in a way, I'm not in a way, but truly, I'm actually really grateful that that happened, because I was so invested already down that path of having reset as a physical space. I invested so much of my time, my energy. There was all this press about the space that had something like the pandemic not happened, I never would have been able to sort of channel that willpower or that strength to walk away and say, I actually made a mistake here. And instead, I would have just continued to double down because I had already invested so much. And so the pandemic actually gave me a really elegant exit for that. And I really believe in that like whatever is for you, of course, there will be challenges, like things are always hard, but there will also carry with it some type of ease. And that when, the path is blocked in a really unmovable way, then there's something to take from that too. And I really think I believe that, I like that path of owning a physical space was not meant for me. And I really feel that, and it's opened up so much. And then I think even now, I'm feeling, some type of shift like that happening, where I think my work will really need to evolve and change. And I'm sort of just sitting in that liminal space of like, okay, what is it? And, just to be like very honest and frank, I wrote this book that I spent 3 years working on that I think has really impacted a lot of people. People write me all the time and they say how meaningful it is. But at the end of the day, I'm really proud of it. But the metric that matters is sales. And it wasn't the best performing book. And I actually had to kind of sit with this disappointment over the past 3 months and think, wow, this thing that I had such dreams and hopes for 3 years didn't really work out the way that I hoped that it would. And it kind of closes down some doors because the sales numbers are not so astronomically amazing. And I think also, where I've arrived is like similar to the space closing down. I'm like, okay, there's something here that I want to figure out. There's some gift or some lesson here about, some path that isn't for me. And I don't think it's like giving up on writing altogether, but there's something that if this book had done really well, the momentum would have carried me down a specific direction that I'm not meant to go down. And I really believe, it's very cheesy, but people always say rejection is protection. And, that's not to say that we shouldn't ever try and fail, because I've done a lot of trying and failing in my life, but sometimes there are moments where the door closes and you don't want it to, but later on you're like, okay, that was great that happened.
Well, I think about one of Steve Jobs' speech where he says the dots always connect in hindsight, like when you look back, right? And you just can't know it in the moment. You like, there's certain things that you just won't know till later. And this is reminding me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine who, when I was pregnant and with my first, and she had already had her first. And I would do, I'm a yoga teacher by trade. I can't remember if I mentioned that, but which is another similarity. Like, as I was reading your book, there's so many things where I was like, oh my gosh. And I would spend 3 weeks at a time in Singapore leading teacher trainings. And I did that like 2-3 times a year for several years before I had my first kid. And I was pregnant. So I did 2 of them when I was pregnant. And I was sitting across from this friend who lived in Singapore at the time. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to be back when the baby's 4 months old. And she just looked at me like, Oh, okay. Okay. Just maybe see how you feel. Maybe, maybe, like, don't schedule it just yet. See how you feel. I was like, no, I'm going to do it. It's going to be fine. Nothing's going to change in my life. Like, and I just, she was really lovely. She wasn't judgmental. She wasn't like, you can't do it, but she was very much just like trying to give me permission to not know how I'm going to feel when I have a newborn. Um, and maybe I'm not going to be able to do something that takes 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for 3 weeks, with a 4-month old. And I had to cancel that teacher training because I had no concept. I mean, I was also really illogical. Like, I thought I was just going to fly to a foreign country with no help and just like, I was literally like, oh, just feed the baby and it'll just sleep when I'm teaching. Like, I just didn't, I was just so in denial about what was potentially coming. And you said earlier something about like wanting to be in control all the time and realizing through your pregnancy journey that like things may not happen exactly on your timeline. And I think as parents, this is something that you learn because you can't force your kid to do anything. You can't force another human to really do anything. And it's really good to have these realizations beforehand. And like, something has to give, right? Like, you can't give 100% of your effort to every aspect of your life. Like, it's not possible, right? Our energy is not infinite. So at various points in your life, you're spending more time in your professional sphere and then in your romantic partnership or taking care of a family member or mothering. Like, you have to give certain things more attention at varying times. And I don't like you created this like really beautiful space to enter into motherhood. And I'm feeling a little emotional because like I didn't do that first time around. I was so determined that nothing was going to change in my life. And it was definitely because like there was so much healing and trauma I hadn't looked at yet at that point. I was 34 when I had my first. And so like everything that came on with motherhood hit me really hard because I was very rigid. I was like, nope, it's going to be on my timeline and nothing's going to change. Um, and it was very different with my second because obviously I'd learned a lot from the first time. And I had so much more malleability in my expectations and just like, so it was much more open-ended. Like, even though I'd already had a kid, and I knew what that looked like, I didn't know what it was going to be like to have this new kid. And that openness in my mind, I swear it made all the difference. And like just the way that she fit into my life and it just made everything much more enjoyable. So I think you have such a good mindset going into this.
Well, I think hearing you say that is in describing your journey with your first is really exactly what I needed to hear because it was so funny this morning. We woke up, my husband and I, and he said, I had a dream last night that you had the baby. And I said, what happened? And he said, in the dream, we were waiting and waiting. The baby wasn't coming. And then I realized that I just had to ask you what was holding you back emotionally. And he said, then we had a conversation and I wasn't sure what the right thing to say was, but then I said this thing about your mom and how you're not your mom. And then literally the baby just shot out right away. And he said, it made me realize that I need to ask you before we go into this birth process, what's blocking you? What do you need to say? What do you need me to say to you? How do we need to talk about this? And I just said the first thing that came to mind, which was that I'm not afraid of the physical notion of it. I have friends who have been really afraid to physically give birth or of the pain. I feel no fear about that, but I think the biggest fear is not knowing who I'm going to be on the other side of this. And of that change, because I've been who I've been for so long. And I really like that person. And I was like, doesn't that worry you? And he was like, well, why would I ever want to be the same person? I have a whole new job with all new skills that I need to learn. Of course I'm going to be different. And he's like, and I feel like I'm going to like that person who I am on the other side of that. And he was like, that's just the trust that you need to have, is that no matter who that person is, how could you not like this person who is a mother, who is less selfish, who, is more generative and creative and so strong that she brought a life into the world, like created a life and then shot it out of her vagina, and he was like, how could that not be an amazing person? And I think it's so beautiful that you're sharing this with me today, because it feels like the punctuation on this question that I've been kind of sitting with all day. And so I wanted to thank you because it's the perfect timing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad. And I'm obviously emotional because what he said is so true. Like, how could you not love the person that's waiting for you on the other side? It's so true. And I've never heard it said that way before. And it's just really beautiful. And what an amazing conversation to have with your husband. Like, that's so lovely. And that it's percolating in his subconscious, right? To come out in his dream. Like, there's like an inner wisdom that's like, oh, I need to talk to Liz about this thing, and to put that out there, I think is because there's so much in life generally that we don't always get super deep and into these things. And when you have a baby, it's very busy, right? As I'm sure everyone's said, it is logistically very busy. And you don't know how it can be this busy, because all the baby really needs is to be fed and changed and, held and, get some sleep. Like, it's very basic, but it is very busy. So once you're in that and you're trying to just figure all that out, for me anyway, I didn't really have the headspace to think about all this deeper stuff that is really crucial. And I didn't know to think about it on the other side. And it's, I think, such a gift that you have, and that you're having this conversation. And I think I was really scared to imagine any identity change, like you said, you have known yourself for your whole life and you like the person that you are. And it just feels scary to be like, wait, what's going to happen? And I let that fear put me into a denial, right? Like, I just rejected that any change was going to happen. I was like, I'm going to be the same. Plus I will have a baby. Like, I thought of it like that.
That's how I think about it too.
Yeah. And like, to an extent, you just can't know. Like, you can't, it's like trying to describe a flavor to somebody, like they've never tried this thing before. And you can only describe it so much, it's something that you have to experience. But the perspective that your husband gave, which is like, well, how could it not be amazing? I completely agree with that. And I think that is so beautiful. And I do think it is for mothers, especially, like, we do go through a change that is really different to what fathers go through. Just, and I would say that I can only speak as like a person of having carried my own children, but it must be true also for mothers that haven't carried their own children. But just speaking to those of us that are carrying our own children, like hormonally, biologically, like, your body is changing. Like, how could it not be so, right? And there is just like a difference. It's really my point is, like, it's really lovely that he was able to say to you what I think is really true and really important, and coming from like a to be father's position, that he has this understanding already. And yeah, I think that's such a wonderful conversation and a wonderful dream. um and just the openness again to, like, whatever will come on the other side, but to be excited to meet this person that's going to be a mother of your child. I think, yeah, it's amazing. And one big thing that I never heard talked about on the other side before I became a mother was that there is a sadness to losing who you were. Like, like, there, how could, it's like, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's not quite like saying goodbye to a friend, but like just like this a sadness of moving through childhood, or the sadness of leaving. Like I loved living with my college roommates. They were like my sisters. And I the moment that we left the apartment we lived in, it's like the end of an era, right? That feeling. And there is a sadness there. And to I don't to be aware of it, to know that that is something, even as it's going to be replaced by something really amazing. That was something I was scared of too. Like I was like, I don't want to be sad about anything. No, and
Yeah.
but it made it, I think it made it that much harder. And there is something, as much as our identity changes, I still feel the core of who I am. I feel like it's just more refined and more vulnerable. And in that way, actually, it is more me. It's just not something that I knew beforehand. It's like a part of me that I didn't know beforehand, but it is like just as authentic and beautiful. And so I'm so excited for you. And I hope you will share with us that follow you how everything goes. And so your baby's due, is it a December due date, or
Yeah. She's going
January?
to come around the holidays.
Okay. I have a good friend of mine who's expecting her first, also via IVF, actually, right, I think the last week of December or something like that. So all this new life coming, which is such a gift. So
Yeah. Thank,
I
thank you. I
wanted,
think that's a beautiful way for you to phrase it, which is that you just, it's not like becoming a different person. Maybe you became like more of yourself, or, like a part of you that was always in there. I love that.
I think it is that way. Yeah, and I was going to ask, so I was eagerly awaiting, I am learning more about the publishing industry and how the numbers are maybe not what people think, as I've been interviewing other writers and everything. But I was just like eagerly waiting to hear about what your next book project might be. But do you think you'll maybe table that at this point? Or are you working on something anyway?
I am working on a book that is actually all about change. And it's called AQ, and it stands for Agility Quotient. And in the book, I postulate that your AQ, which is your ability to change and sit with the unknown and uncertainty, is actually way more important than one's IQ or even EQ.
Mm-hmm.
Because, there are a lot of really brilliant people in the world who have a tough time adapting. And in this world that we live in, where change is exponential, that's all that matters. And I wrote the proposal. I sent it out to my agent. We are sending it to my editor from the last book to see if she's interested. And if not, then we'll take it out to other publishers. So that's exciting. I had been hoping to finish writing the book before I had this baby, because I had this tremendous fear that I would lose motivation and like willpower after the baby's born. But then I thought, if I'm writing a book about change, maybe I should give myself the time, the space to go through this change myself in like the most transformative moment of my life so far, and then write the book as the other person on the other side. So that's my most recent shift. So I'll probably write it next year, and then I imagine it'll come out in 2025.
I just got full on chills when you said that, because it could not be more perfect. Yes, the change on the other side. And what a beautiful place to end our conversation too, I think. Thank you, Liz, so much. This was so just like heartwarming and soul nourishing. And yeah, I hope we can stay in touch, and I can't wait to see how everything goes. And maybe I will meet you sometime when you're in New York. Like it'd be
Yeah, I would
so
love
nice.
that.
Yeah, it would be
I
so
would
nice.
love that.
Yeah, I
Let's
will
definitely
connect
make
with
it
you.
happen.
I
Yes. And
love to.
thank you for sharing your mothering experiences. They're like literally coming at the exact right, perfect moment.
Oh, I
Thank you,
love
Leah.
that. Thank you so much. Okay. And as far as this podcast, it'll probably launch in like 2 to 3 weeks, depending.
Amazing.
And I will probably get in touch with you again just to I'm going to look at your Instagram just to see maybe if there's pictures I can pull from there, or if you want to email me, because I like to like just use 1 or 2 pictures just to
I'll
market it.
email
And
you.
Okay. Sounds good.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yay.
much.
Thank you for having me. And then let's because I'm in Fort Greene now. So let's meet
Oh,
up sometime
okay.
in
We're
Brooklyn.
so close. Yes. Okay. I would love
Yeah.
to. All
Okay.
right.
We'll
Have a
email
good
about it.
day. Yes. All
Okay.
right.
Bye.
Bye.